Я снова приветствую вас, уважаемые участники.
Welcome, dear participants of the third forum of the Social Innovation of the Regions. We are starting our work in the Moscow Hall. We will work till evening. How to create happy environment around you. That's the topic of the presentation. It will be in English, and you'll have interpretation. Please take your headsets. It will take an hour and a half for the presentation, and after that Q&A session will take place. We have mics in the hall, in the meeting room, and you can, if you have a question, you should approach the mic and ask a question. So Jen Lim will offer his presentation. He is Chief Happiness Officer. Jane Lim, Innovation General Director of Delivering Happiness. She was a consultant during the startup of the company, starting from 2003. Now it's multi-billion-dollar business. Jen Lee helped more than 350 companies, and she is dealing with the happiness in companies, cities all over the world. His task is to create happy environments everywhere. In 2017, she was elected to the Global Happiness Counselor. She offers his presentations all over the world, inspiring people, companies, and countries. Now, at the third forum of social innovations of the region, Jen Lee offers her presentation, How to Create Happy Environment Around You.
The innovative CEO and co-founder of Delivering Happiness, Jen Lim. Hello, Jen.
Hello.
Welcome to Moscow.
Thank you. Спасибо.
Oh, I know that it isn't your first visit to Moscow, yeah?
No, it's actually my second.
Yeah, and did you have time to walk around the city? Maybe you have noticed any changes from your last visit?
From the last time, just walking around the city, the biggest change was the fact that it was winter last time I was here, and it's definitely summer when I arrived. So that was probably the biggest drastic change. But it was really cool to go visit the new park yesterday, and we did this virtual reality tour of Moscow and Russia. So that was probably the newest feature I saw.
Yeah, I know that you travel a lot around the world, participating in different social events, forums. What can you say about this event today, and what do you feel about the atmosphere? Maybe did you visit any exhibitions here already?
Yeah, I think that you're asking about change. That's probably one of the biggest changes I've seen. When I was here last 5-6 years ago and talking about happiness in businesses and companies and communities, I think at that time it was more just like an interesting, novel idea. But now that there's this forum, Social Innovation Forum, specifically to talk about topics like happiness, well-being, and healthy living, I think that's the biggest change, that there's a serious commitment shown by people, by Moscow, by Russia, that they really care about what it means to be happy.
So thank you, and I guess it's the best time to give you the floor and begin the most interesting part.
Yes?
Ladies and gentlemen, Jen Lim, ваши аплодисменты.
Thank you. Привет.
Hello. Thank you.
Much only 2 words I know, except for the most important one, Nostrovia. That's the last one. Thank you so much for being a part and coming to see and hear what the latest I've been learning about this whole space of happiness and what it is in the global sphere, but most importantly, what it means for you as an individual in this global society. I'll talk a lot about organizational happiness because that is our focus of delivering happiness as a company. We are here to change the way we work so that knowing that we spend so many waking hours of our days at the workplace, it's so important for us to actually be happy at work and know that that then gets transcended into our everyday lives. First from ourselves, then to the people around us, your friends and your family, and ultimately the community in which you live. So I'll be talking a lot about those concepts from a scientific level, and hopefully that you can apply it to you, yourself, and also to your workplace. Let's see, so one thing that we started to do at Delivering Happiness, I'm going to call it DH. I don't know if you are fans of Twitter, but we've been testing this out at my talks. So our Twitter handle is @DHMovement, and @DHMovement CEO is my own Twitter handle. And any course of the time, if you have any questions, or one of our most popular questions that we like to ask is, what's something weird that makes you happy? So anytime that anything comes up, please feel free to tweet us. We'd love to hear from you. So, going through all these reflections of the time that I've been in this happiness space, it's been about, 10, 15 years of doing this DH happiness consulting from the Zappos days. I've learned a lot, but I really wanted to simplify everything into a very simple equation. So our belief is that, number one, if you make your employees happier first, then you'll have happier customers, and then you'll have a more profitable, sustainable business. But most importantly, you're creating meaningful lives. Creating meaningful lives not just of your customers, but of yourselves and your coworkers and anyone you really touch in your day-to-day business. But when I talk about this equation, most people just shake their, nod. They said, yeah, of course, this makes sense. Why wouldn't any company do this? Why wouldn't any community do this? But the next question becomes how? How do you put something like this very simple equation into place? But most importantly, how do you sustain it over time? And I'm going to just pause and talk about this word culture for a second. When I talk about organizational culture, this word's being used so many times around the world these days, but what does it really mean? And so for us, to put it into, again, business terms, because that's what be mostly the focus of the talk, and then I'll talk about community repercussions, but this is how we define culture. So strategy is what you think, brand is what you say, and culture is what you do. And so one of the jokes that we have internally at DH is culture is also what you do when your boss isn't looking. And we can all think about specific examples in the world today of companies that when they have bad, toxic cultures, what does that do to their company and to their brand? So our belief of those things, think, say, do, strategy, brand, and culture, all of those three things is our belief when you want to have a happy, profitable company, that happens only when you have think, say, do in harmony. So your brand, your strategy, and your culture in harmony. So again, the question becomes how? How do we put something like this into place? So I just wanted to take a pause for a second, though. I wanted to hear and get a sense of how many people in this room have heard of Zappos before? Okay, great, thank you. And thank you. And how many people have heard about Delivering Happiness? It was a book that was actually launched in 2010. Raise the hands. All right, awesome. And if you were to guess the percentage of people in the world that are unhappy in their workplace, what would you guess, percentage-wise? I'm going to put a number out there, and when you think you hear the number, raise your hand. So again, the percentage of people unhappy at work in the world, 20%? 40? 60? 80? 90? Okay, we've got some pessimistic people in the audience today. I'll come back to that later. And then last question for now. For those in the room, if you feel you know how to predict your own personal, meaningful, long-term happiness for yourself, raise of hands. Okay, that's pretty good, actually. I love asking that question because, and maybe because this is a conference on social innovation, that kind of increases the percentage a little bit, but I love asking that question because most times, no matter where I am in the world, only about 5% of the room raises their hand. And maybe it's because I'm talking at their employer or place of work. But it really, really astounds me, the fact that I've been doing this for so long and consistently the percentage of people that know how to understand and predict their personal happiness globally is so low. And it makes me wonder why. Because here we are constantly getting more advanced in technology, in our socioeconomics, we're feeling progress all the time, yet we, as a global society, are still fundamentally unhappy. And this is not a new concept by any means. There was a guy by the name of Aristotle back in 200 BC, and what he said was that happiness is actually the purpose of our existence. But more importantly, what he said was that happiness is dependent on ourselves. And I'd like everyone to kind of think about that for a second, dependent on ourselves. What does that actually mean, and how do we make that work? So, before I go into the rest of my talk, I wanted to pull up some real-world examples. Can everyone see this okay? Yeah? Okay, we've got Sam in the middle there, on the top. He just received his financial statement from Merrill Lynch. He thought he would be a happy guy, but his retirement plan wasn't making him happy that day. And then we've got Stella on the bottom left there. She's just unhappy because her parents won't upgrade her phone. But sincerely, though, I would love everyone to answer this question. Take a moment to think, what are your own personal goals in life? And what's interesting about this question is no matter how you answer it or who you ask, I want to be happier, or I want to be a successful entrepreneur, I want to have a family, I want to be healthier. If you ask yourself why enough times, it usually goes back to the same thing. I want to be happy, or I want to make sure the people in my life that I love are happy too. But what's interesting about this is that, and this, again, we go back to the science of it, and so this is real data and research being done on what happiness is and isn't. The researcher is telling us that we as human beings are actually hardwired to seek that happiness, yet we are really, really bad at predicting what that happiness is. I'll give you a couple examples. They did studies of people that won the lottery, and you would think, hey, I won the lottery, I'll be happy for the rest of my life, but now we know their happiness level stays the same or actually decreases over time. What's also interesting is that they did studies of people that got disabled, so they lost their sight or their use of their limbs, and then they actually saw that their happiness level stayed the same or actually increased over time. So what this is telling us is that we as human beings are really, really bad at predicting what can sustain our own personal happiness for ourselves. So I started reflecting about this a little bit because I find it really, really ironic that I'm here so passionate about happiness. Because when I was growing up in school, I was not that person. I was not happy-go-lucky. I was actually a cynic. I was kind of overthinking things all the time. I was reading books like The Stranger by Albert Camus. If you've heard of this book, it's actually what's told to be the brilliant story of total despair. And that's describing my childhood. I read this book in French, so you can't get much more gloomier than that. In school, I was listening to songs with my Walkman on by The Cure or Depeche Mode. I don't know if you're fans of Cure, Depeche Mode in the audience. You guys know this band from, the UK? So, very dark and gloomy stuff. So the irony is here I am talking about why happiness matters. So I started reflecting a little bit. And for me, I went back to my childhood. And for me, I'm Asian American. So as an Asian American, my parents were from Hong Kong. They immigrated to the United States decades ago. So for whatever reason in that household, for me, I thought there were 3 essential ways to be successful in life. Number 1 was get into a good school. Number 2 was become a doctor or a lawyer. And number 3 was learn a variety of musical instruments. And so for me, I thought I had it made. I thought I was successful because I got into UC Berkeley, which is a school in California. I was studying to be a doctor, I was in pre-med, and I had several years of piano under my belt. But once I started studying, I realized, you know what? This doesn't feel like me. So I started wandering, and I stumbled upon something called Asian American Studies. And so this is an actual major at UC Berkeley. And all of a sudden, I got so excited about this topic because I learned everything about myself, about my ancestors, and all they did to help the country get to where it was at the time. So I just got really excited and passionate, and I just decided to major in it. And so I picked up the phone to call up my parents to let them know, and you can probably predict the next scene. They completely freaked out. They said, Asian American Studies? Why don't you just come home more often? We'll tell you what your Asian American Studies life is all about. We're working all these jobs for you and your 2 brothers and give you opportunities we never ever imagined. Your great-great-great-grandparents sailed the Pacific Ocean and almost died so that you can tell us you're going to study yourself. And so I said, wow, they're really good at this guilt thing. But I stood my ground, I put my foot down, and I decided to major in it. And I remember that moment. I graduated, I was in my apartment, and I finally realized what my parents were talking about. I couldn't find a job. So it was my turn to freak out, and I started cold calling every single company I knew. And luckily for me, the Silicon Valley internet craze was born. The dot-com boom came about, and I got lucky. So instantly for me, you guys know the story, the dot-com boom, money, title, status, really just fell in my lap almost overnight. And you know the end of that story. The dot-com busted, and the money, title, status was gone. And I remember that moment. I got fired, I got laid off, and I felt like a total loser. And it was not just because I got fired, it was because I thought the money, title, status meant everything, when it really didn't mean that much at all. And I realized at that exact moment what I was running away from, which was, what would I do with my life if I did not fear failure? So at that point, I said, you know what, I'm just going to do something out of my element, and I decided to climb a mountain. I chose Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, and so I called up my buddy Tony, who's the CEO of Zappos at that time as well. I said, hey, do you want to climb this mountain with me? He said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So if you can imagine us, here we are, the 2 of us, we're in our 20s, we're climbing this mountain. I just lost my job. Tony just sold his first company to Microsoft for about $280 million. Clearly, we are at the opposite ends of the financial spectrum. But what was really interesting, though, is that we were actually thinking the same exact thing while we were climbing this mountain, which was, what would we do with our lives if money didn't matter? So fast forward, we actually summited the mountain. It was just beautiful. It was just straight out of a movie. The sun was rising over the Serengeti, and we were both just standing there in disbelief of like, wow, maybe anything can happen. And so at that point, we went back to our lives. Tony went back to Zappos and actually decided to invest his own money into a company that was on the brink of bankruptcy. And I go back to my life, and I had that moment happen. And that moment happens to everyone in this room, if not at least once, but multiple times. It feels like when your life does a 180, or when someone pulls out the rug from under your feet. And for me, it was facing my greatest fear. And my greatest fear was losing someone in my life that I couldn't imagine life without. And that was losing my dad. And I lost him to colon cancer. So once again, I was thinking, what is this all for? Why am I even here? And so at that point, I said, you know what? I'm going to look at life like a green field. I'm just going to do things that I'm super passionate about. I started writing, I started doing design, I started making films, just things that I thought were real and of substance and meaning to me. And through that process, I didn't even realize, I realized my own core values. Because if it wasn't the money, title, status that was making me happy, what was it? And I knew at that point, it was the people in my life. And if I made every decision based on that priority of people, I would never look back, or I could never look back with regret. So in some weird parallel process, that's how I stumbled upon the company Zappos.com. And when I first met it, it was just a tiny little startup, and all it wanted to do was sell the most shoes in the world. But then it grew up, and they said, you know what, we want to be the best at customer service. But then they grew up again, and they said, you know what, we want to be the best at delivering happiness for our employees. And so through that process, they realized they weren't just selling shoes, they actually had a higher purpose too. And their higher purpose was to deliver happiness to their customers, especially employees, and generally the world. So I'm going to pause a little bit here because fast forward from that moment, 7 years later, that's when Delivering Happiness, the book, and now the company was born. But I'm going to pause on this slide because I'd love everyone to take a look at this. This is an exercise that we do with every single one of our clients, and it's simply called the Happiness Heartbeat exercise. And all I did is very simple. All I did was plot the highs and the lows of my life. And as I looked at the highs and lows, I asked myself, what values were there or not there? What people were there or not there? And what's interesting about this exercise is once you answer those questions, you start answering your own ways of how to fulfill and sustain a meaningful life of happiness for yourself. So I invite everyone to think about that because for us at DH, happiness is not all about understanding your highs, it's actually understanding your lows and what was going on in your moment, in those moments of your life. And that's how we carry on what we can be in being more sustainably happy in our lives. So I'll talk about a little bit more about Zappos as a case study of a company that became multi-billion dollars using happiness as a business model. So this is a picture of Zappos back in the US, and I think of this quote when I think of this company. People will forget what you say, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that was by Maya Angelou. And why I love it, not only because it's a great personal mantra, but I love it because a company, and now more companies, are actually understanding this is the way that we can do business. So for them, they put so much time, money, and resources into creating some of the most efficient warehouses in the world. But for them, it wasn't about the technology, it was about doing something else. It was about what they called internally PEC, personal emotional connection with everyone they touch. So that, as an example, let's just say someone living in New York, a mom, before she puts her kids to bed, orders a pair of shoes, goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, before she goes to work, wow, there's a box of shoes at her doorstep. So all they did to invest was all to actually create that PEC, personal emotional connection, with every single customer they touch. But what's interesting is that even though they're known for their customer service, that was not their internal priority at all. It was actually company culture. And their thought there was that if you get their culture right, everything else, like having amazing customer service, or having more productive, engaged employees, or having a more profitable business, all that other stuff actually comes naturally. So this was sort of an experiment when we started doing this 15, 17 years ago. And so we learned a lot of things along the way, and we did different things along the way. And some of the things we did was, I'll cite an example, was that we paid people to quit. So every trainee, during that 5 weeks of training, we gave them a check saying, take it or leave it at any time, no questions asked. And it started at $100, went to $200,000, now I believe is that $2,000 check. And the reason why we did that is to say, do you really want to be here? Do you want to believe in our values? Are you going to live up to our higher purpose? And it was an open invitation for them to take that check and leave. And the reason why I did that is to make sure we can preserve this sense of culture and values, and therefore happiness across employees and then customers. That was one test. We also did the culture book, which was another kind of risky maneuver. It was basically, we asked ourselves, how do you even define the company culture? So we said, hey, why don't we ask our employees? So we asked them, can you submit 2 to 3 paragraphs of what you think Zappos culture means to you? We published it in these physical books. And we actually just handed them out to whoever wanted it. And it was such an interesting thing because what we did was we printed it completely unedited. So what that meant was that the good stuff was in there and the bad stuff. And so it became a very transparent look as to whether or not Zappos, are we actually holding up to our commitment of really investing in our employees and really saying, hey, we want you to be happy. So it was as a result, we thought it was just going to be for the employees, for the culture. We started sending these books out around the world, and all of a sudden people started giving us fan mail and saying, I love what you do, I love what you stand for, even though they never felt our product, even though they never talked to a customer service rep. So in the end, it became a brand book for them too. It's really interesting as I was doing all these consulting engagements, and I went to so many different companies, and they have these fancy plaques on the wall of, these are our core values, or this is our mission statement. And here's one that we thought, this was actually in 2000. Here are their core values: communication, respect, integrity, excellence. And I think you're pretty familiar with core values in your own maybe everyday companies or companies around the world. But so many times it's just meaningless words on the wall. And as an example, these are actually the core values of a company that existed back in 2000. And if you were to guess which company it was, I think you'd be really shocked to hear that these four core values were for a company called Enron that, as you probably might have heard back at the time, basically embezzled $84 billion from their customers. So how can we as corporations have a conscious mind of having these values up on our walls when we know so much as other things that are not happening according to their values are going the other way? And that was back in 2000, but we see that all the time here in today's world, where people within companies, whether it's from the CEO to the employees at Wells Fargo creating false accounts to make more money essentially for their sales team, we see it all the time now, and to Facebook actually getting discredited because they're using our personal information in unknown ways. So when we talk about culture, it really comes back down to how does it not just impact companies, but also their bottom line, and obviously the people that are within the companies too. So to bring it back to the positive side of what company culture can do, we at Zappos saw that by focusing on culture and by focusing on customer service, they became a several billion-dollar company, and as some of you may know, they were acquired by Amazon.com back in the day for about $1.2 billion at the time of closing. But what's great is that it's not just Zappos doing it. So this chart is showing us these are the best places to work, according to Fortune magazine. And in the last 15 years, consistently what it's shown us is that those companies that double down on their people, essentially, are actually more profitable and more successful than the other companies that didn't. So this is what the data is telling us time and time again. If we care about our people, we can actually be more profitable and create more meaningful lives. But even with all this data that's telling us, we still have this. And this is not just in America, this is all over the world. So as I asked that question earlier, what percentage of people do you feel are unhappy around the world? You're about right. It was 87%, and that's causing us a loss of $500 billion, and that's just in the US alone. So the question is, what can we do about it, and how does this apply to you as a person that is in the workforce? So I'm going to take a step back away from happiness for a second. I'm going to think about it in a more bigger terms. Why is this the case in our society today? So for us, we came back, if we look back into our history, we were all mostly farmers around the world. We called the agrarian age. And then we evolved. And then we came to this industrial age. So we started working in factories, changed the way our families had living. And then we went to the technology age. And now I feel we're at a different age. And what I'm calling it is the adaptive age. And the reason why is because there's so many changes that are happening in this world around us at a speed and pace that we've never ever seen before. So we have things like, of course, social media, but we have tracking things. We have things that our phone connected to our car, connected probably to the chair you're sitting in. And all of these things that are coming around us and at us, it's amazing. It means like we're more connected than we were ever before in the world. We have all these tools and resources that we never even imagined. But what it's also causing us is a lot of chaos and internal strife. With all these changes around us, what does it mean for ourselves? So that's why I think this whole, even why this conference even exists as an example, whether it's here in Moscow or one of our clients in the UAE or Dubai or somewhere in the States, no matter where we are in the world, what we're seeing is this really personal need to understand what this means to live in this adaptive age. Because with all these changes around us, we have a higher priority all of a sudden to understand, who am I? What are my values? What is my higher purpose? How can I be more self-aware? Because with all these changes, it causes complexity and chaos around me, but internally, I need simplicity. Internally, I need to be grounded in something that means something to me. So that's why I believe we have such a huge surgence of these kind of conferences, and also the demand for happiness in our workplaces. So what are we going to do about it? How can we make these changes? Especially with businesses, when I call it the adaptive change, for those companies that don't adapt, or for the companies that refuse to change, we used to think Blockbuster and BlackBerry would be here forever. We now know they're not. But for those companies that are changing and that are adapting, like Netflix, like Apple, they continue to survive, if not thrive, because they have that ability to adapt to change. So whether you're a company or an individual, a mom, a dad, a student, the belief here is that because of all these changes, we, to be happy, can control and change what we can within ourselves, our own happiness, and we need to be able to embrace and adapt to things that we can't control. Things like having illness in the family, or having a death in the family, or having to sit in traffic for an hour every time you go outside. Those are things that we cannot control, but those are things that we can understand and come to actually predict and expect, if not embrace. And that, for me, is a big key to what happiness is. It's expectation management. Of course we want the best, but we also know the worst can happen, and we just need to realize anything can happen within that gamut. So back in the 80s, Steve Jobs told us to think different. I really believe it's time that we can work different too. And these are the things that we've been working on for the last almost 10 years now, to understand, how do we change the way that we work? Knowing we spend so much time in our workplace, what can we do? So over those years, we've learned many things, but I'm just going to talk about 6 things that we learned along the way. Number 1 was commitment. And this sounds the most simple, but it's actually the hardest thing to do. And what that means is, are we as companies, are we committed to the fact that culture, strategy, and brand are all high priorities, and they actually should be in harmony? Because the biggest success and fail factor of companies that say they have a culture or a strong culture is that they think when they launch the culture, it'll just live by itself. But the reality is that you have to be there committed with your resources, with your money, with your efforts, with your time, to really create a sustainable long-term culture. So we know what culture isn't anymore. It's not giving you free drinks or free Red Bull in the fridge. It's not having a ping pong table in the rec room for your leisure. It's something so much more meaningful than that. So number 1, are we going to be committed? The second thing that we learn is to build meaningful relationships at work. And this one is a really big one, because in the science of happiness, to have sustainable happiness is to have meaningful relationships. So how do we do that at work? So our belief is, remember I talked about that concept, PEC, personal emotional connection. How do you do that with not just your customers? How do you create PEC with your colleagues, your coworkers, people you have to talk to every day? So that is our big belief of creating these meaningful relationships beyond what your task is, beyond what your role is. Who are we as individuals, and how can we get to know each other that way? So we actually want to show up to work not because they're our coworkers. We want to show up to work because they're our friends. I love this quote by Simon Sinek: when people are financially invested, they want to return, but when they're emotionally invested, they want to contribute. And that's from Simon Sinek. I'm going to put a pause on a second for this quote. Does anyone know who said this? If the person you're talking to isn't listening, be patient. He maybe has a piece of small fluff in his ear. Does anyone know who said that quote? One of our most profound thinkers of our time. That was Winnie the Pooh. Does Winnie the Pooh, is it popular here or not really? Yes, no, kind of. Okay, so number 3 thing we learned is commitment to transparency. And this one's really simple. Transparency means be real, be yourself. And this is a huge part of being happy. It's understanding that you don't want to leave your life hat at home when you go to work. You want to leave your life hat everywhere you go. You just want to be yourself. So how can we actually be transparent and feel like we can live authentically, whether we're at work or life? That's why we don't even believe in work-life balance. We actually believe in work-life integration. Because we're spending so much time at our work, why would it be separate? And the one and the same is just basically our life. Another way we've committed to transparency is that we encourage our clients to embrace tensions. And by tensions, what I mean is like you know that every day at work's not going to be happy. That's just not going to be realistic. And you know there's going to be times when there's going to be low moments. So what we say is embrace tensions and be transparent about it. There's a story of what recently happened to me. I was at a client of mine. They're actually a big global multinational coffee retailer. You might have heard of them before. They're called Starbucks. And they were having town hall meetings with all of their employees. And it was really interesting. I sat in one. And most of the time with town halls, you have people kind of complaining about each other. But there was this one woman that stood up. And she said, I have a story to share. And basically, the other day, I found out middle of the night, I got a call, one of my relatives passed away. But I had to show up at work anyway. I had to get stuff done. So I showed up to work, and I went into this meeting, a normal meeting that we always have, and I was just clearly not myself, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. And I was being mad at everyone. I was being very short and curt, and everyone noticed, but I couldn't say anything. But during that meeting, I noticed someone looking at me. And after the meeting, she came over to me, took my hand, and pulled me aside and said, "Hey, are you okay?" And she said that was the most simple thing she could say to me. And it changed my whole day. It changed my whole way of looking at things that day, because everyone else was looking at me as like, what's wrong with this woman? Like, why is she even here? Why do I have to work with her? There was the one person that actually looked at me like a human being and said 3 simple words to make me realize it is okay. I'm not today, but I will be. And so this is an example of what we say, be transparent. We are all human beings, and we all know that we're not going to have the best days at work. So whether it's going to be us one of those days or someone around us, we all know it's going to happen. So how can we be transparent and embrace tensions with one another? So the next thing we learned is about creating teams and building the right ones. And so what we suggest for all of our employees, or all of our clients, is to hire slow and fire quick. And I know this sounds really harsh. Hire slow, fire quick. But why we say that is because we all know it just takes that one person, whether it's in the meeting or in the department or in the whole company. It just takes one person to be changing the dynamic of everyone's experience or happiness. And we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth this one person that's not living by our values or not communicating with respect, so that everyone else gets impacted and they lose productivity and they lose engagement and they ultimately lose happiness? So for our answer is no, it's not worth it. So that's why we say hire slow, the right people with the right values aligned, and fire quick. The other thing we say is also hire and fire based on values. And this one is really hard for a lot of the companies in the world, because you'll have people that are rock star performers, like let's say amazing salespeople, but yet they're not living next or according to the values. Maybe they're not communicating with honesty and respect. And what we say is that is actually grounds for firing. Because again, it only takes that one person to really change the whole dynamic and therefore happiness for everyone else, and it's not worth it for your bottom line or for your sanity. How to build the right teams. There was a great analogy, and it's an article that was written in Wired magazine, and it talked about the ways that animals move in their natural habitat. So the first animals that these scientists looked at were bees. And so what they noticed with these bees is that they're in their hives, making their honey. They're getting their job done, but they're kind of chaotic, butting heads all the time. Then they looked at fish. So they looked at mackerel in the sea, and they noticed that they swim faster and faster when they feel threatened, like they were going to die. So again, they were getting their job done. They were surviving, but they weren't really getting anywhere, like the bees, kind of chaotic, kind of stationary. And then they looked lastly at birds. So birds, if you can imagine, let's just imagine like birds flying over the Serengeti. They all fly in one direction until one bird, random bird, changes direction. Then they'll all fly with it. Same thing, another random bird changes direction, they'll all fly with it. And so what's interesting here is that even though they're all individual organisms, all individual animals, together as a flock, they're actually acting as one organism. So what was really interesting about this whole scientific experiment was that they realized the algorithm of movement for all of these different animals were exactly the same, no matter what animal. But it had one difference and one variable, and that variable is what they called alignment. So the bees had the least to no alignment, but the birds had the most alignment for them to act that way and behave that way. So I found this fascinating because we can completely apply this to our organizations, to our cultures, to our communities. Just think of it in a way of how do we apply this, the bird scenario, to our companies, to our teams. It's when we create a strong culture. It's when we create values and have that bond us by basically this DNA. When we have that uniting us, then we as individuals, us as human beings and employees, individually can act in independent ways. Be true to our authentic selves, actually bring our real selves to work with the faith and the trust and the communication, knowing that we're all birds just flying in the same direction to the same goal, but in the least we can actually be ourselves. So imagine if we can create organizations that can be like this all the time. The fifth thing we learn is purpose, and this is a higher purpose. It's very simple. Why do we do the things we do on a day-to-day basis? What's the larger vision that our companies can give our employees so that they're not just showing up for the paycheck? Don't get me wrong, it's important. We all want to get paid. We all need that. This is true. But what can we inspire them to believe that's beyond the paycheck? And so one of the things that we learned to be able to do this is that by understanding your individual higher purpose, if you ask yourself what their higher purpose is, it's so important to identify that so then you can align that with the company. And if it's not aligned, you have to ask yourself, am I even working at the right company? Or did I create the right company to begin with? So what is that higher purpose for yourself, and how can you actually feel like you're living by it on a day-to-day basis? The last thing we learned is core values. And again, going back to that example of Enron, clearly a company that did not live by their core values. But ask yourselves, what are my company's core values? And then actually pull out your own personal core values, or define them if you haven't, and put them out and align them. And ask yourself, hey, do these align? Do I believe in these core values that I work at? And if you do, it would be great. Because then you're showing up because you believe in your company's core values as well, because they're aligned with your own. So then it's not some sort of drudgery to kind of need to go to work anymore just for that paycheck. It's because there's a higher purpose to it. It's because your own values are aligned to that of your company. And then you know you're actually going to be more productive, more engaged, and therefore more happy when you go to work. So why I talk about purpose and why I talk about core values at the very end there is just to give us, from a company standpoint, a representation of what we believe in. So brand is actually the external expression of your company, and culture is your internal expression. So people, what they do on a day-to-day basis. And what binds that, because we believe culture and brand are two sides of the same coin, what binds that together are your company's higher purpose and your company's values. Higher purpose, again, is what is your company that's doing that's greater than making more money? What are your values that your company believes in? Because now, globally, we now know more and more the companies that we as individuals want to be a part of or pay for their customer or for their goods are companies that we actually believe in. So in thinking that through, how might that apply to you and your own company that you work with? I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk more about the science of happiness. And so what does this have to tell us? There's been a lot of research. Now it's about 20 years of what scientific happiness means. And through that, we now know there are ways to increase our happiness, whether it's at work or in general life. And here are the 4 levers or ways to go about doing that. Number 1 is sense of control. So sense of control is to feel like, hey, do I feel like I have autonomy? Do I feel like I have freedom? Do I feel like I can make decisions and act upon them? And do I feel like someone else will respect me for doing it? So that's a huge part of happiness at work or in general life. But just thinking about that in your role at work, if we make sure we are giving people trust and autonomy to make decisions, that will increase their happiness. Ritz-Carlton is a great example of it. Here's a company that's known famously around the world for their customer service. Why? One of the big things is because they believe in their employees. They give them thousands of dollars budget every year, no matter who they are, whether they're the frontliner or in the housekeeping. They give them budget to say, hey, whatever you need to do to please the customer, because we believe in you. And that makes their employees happier because they feel they have that sense of control and trust. The second lever that we talk about in happiness is sense of progress. So sense of progress is, am I growing? Am I developing? Am I learning more in my job? So there's a lot of ways that you can introduce this idea of sense of progress. One of the ways that we actually experimented with at Zappos is that every merchandiser has to go 18 weeks of training. I'm sorry, 18 months of training, sorry. And at first when we implemented, people were like, okay, that's fine, 18 months, that's fine. But then we said, you know what, every third of the way, we'll celebrate. We'll say, hey, congratulations, 6 months, you got this far and this is how much more you have to go. And just from that act alone, there was no increase in pay. We saw people's happiness levels rise because all of a sudden they started feeling like they were progressing faster than they were before. So think about it in your own line of work, of how can you make sure every person has a role where they feel that they can actually achieve their job. And even if it's going to take years to get to this project done, at least celebrate those milestones along the way so you're seeing and feeling that sense of progress. That increases happiness. The third thing is connectedness, that's the depth and breadth of your relationships, and I mentioned that earlier. And the last one is vision and meaning. I'll talk about that more in the next slide. So this is the types of happiness. It's a framework that we talk about in the book. And so there's 3 types according to the science. And the first one is pleasure. And it's on the lower quadrant there because pleasure is like, as you can imagine, it's just the things that we like to do on a day-to-day basis, like we want to go out with our friends, or we want to buy new shoes, or we want to go on a vacation. All these things are really important things for us as human beings. But unfortunately, it's very fleeting. So what we see is that our happiness levels goes up when we get those new pair of shoes, and then it immediately comes down. So in other words, it's not very sustainable. And we call it not just the pleasure happiness, but we also call it the rock star happiness because it's hard to sustain, unless, of course, you are a rock star. The next kind of happiness is what we call passion or flow. So this is actually something that is a psychological term, and it was developed in the sense of think about your own activities. When you do something and you're so engaged in it that it feels like just minutes have gone by, but in reality, hours have gone by. So think about whatever that might be. It could be gardening, it could be kite surfing, it could be photography. Any of these things that you feel when you're in your flow, when you're in your passion state, that's what helps us actually sustain our happiness. So this concept, flow, is developed by a gentleman, a psychologist. His name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. Actually, he's Hungarian. And so rumor has it that he had to develop this concept flow because he had to say his name 10 times really fast. But anyway, the last type of happiness, and this is the most important one to think about, because no matter what scientists you talk to, it always comes back to this, to the question of how do we, as human beings, sustain our own personal happiness? Time and time again, it comes back to higher purpose and meaning. So what does that mean? What am I doing that's beyond just myself? What is my company doing that's beyond making more money? So the more we as individuals can define what that is, and not only just define, but also live it on a day-to-day basis, whether you're at home or at work, ideally both, then we as human beings can be as engaged and happy as we can, knowing there's going to be highs and lows, as we talked about earlier in the heartbeat exercise. So with all of this sort of studying of all this academic information about scientific happiness, it became an aha moment for us in that, hey, the ways to be individually happy as a human being is totally parallel with that of a business. So that as individuals, we all need pleasures, and for businesses, we all know we need profits. Otherwise, there's no happiness to talk about. But now we know, unless we layer on passion and purpose, higher purpose on top, the odds of us sustaining our own personal happiness or the happiness or profitability of our companies, the odds of that happening for the long term are going to be against us. And so what might that tell us? If these are all the stats and the data and the stories, how might that impact you in your life and in your company? So I'm going to shift gears and talk about the book a little bit. This is a picture that Tony, I captured when Tony and I started working on the book 10 years ago now. It's kind of crazy, but this is in Lake Tahoe, which is in California. And we were kind of freaking out because we hadn't started the book yet. It hadn't started writing the book yet. So we tried to think of all these different ways to motivate each other. First, we drank a lot of coffee, like tons of caffeine. And then we moved on to, and you might appreciate this, seeing we are in Moscow. And then we moved on to vodka, like tons of vodka. And then we even moved to vodka and coffee together. It worked really well the first few nights, but I would not recommend it the night after. But anyway, we finally got the book done, and we put it up to the publishers, and it was pretty amazing. It was like very surreal to me. It did really well, got translated into 24 languages. We've sold about 1 million copies. This was a mind-blowing episode for us. We did not expect this at all. We just thought we were putting a book out. And what we realized with every email that we got, every story telling us people were changing their lives because they realized their life could change if they prioritized happiness first. And I'm not talking about pleasure happiness. I'm talking about meaningful, purpose-driven happiness. So we started getting all these emails from all over the world, and so we just said how inspired we were by people making this decision. So that's why one of our core values still is inspire and be inspired. And that comes from every single person has the ability to inspire by being true to your genuine, authentic self. And that is an inspiration for someone else that wants to find that too. So one of the stories I want to share from the book tour, we went around the country, eventually around the world, in this bus that I shared earlier, that picture. And we stopped at this school in Arizona. And why we stopped is because one of the teachers there, and this is one of the poorest schools out there, one of the teachers sent us an email and said, hey, I love your book, but we can't afford a book per child. Can you send us some books? And we were like, yeah, of course, why not? Of course we will. Sent the books, decided to surprise them when we went to Arizona, and they surprised us. We got off the bus, they had this amazing mariachi band playing. Remember, this is one of the poorest schools in that state. They had this amazing mariachi band playing, they had all this food in front of us, and they had so much generosity of spirit when they had so little in terms of money and resources. So after this, they said, thank you for coming. We're so inspired. We realized that you don't have a Spanish translation of your book. So they said, we're going to translate it for you. So they basically crowdsourced the teachers, students, translated the whole book to us, sent it to us, and said, we don't want anything in return. We just want to say thanks. Again, we were floored by their generosity. A few months later, this time I get a email from a publisher in Spain. And he said, hey, I want to be able to sell all your books in Spanish territories throughout the world. And we're like, okay, but we already have a translation. So finally we had some negotiation back and forth. We finally came to an agreement. And now that this book is published, and it's been several years now, every single book sold in every single Spanish territory in the entire world, a part of those proceeds from that book actually go back to these kids in Arizona. And it's one of those meaningful moments that became like an aha to me, that there was something bigger, because they had no idea by basically paying happiness forward how much they would get back in return. And so I knew we were onto something, a feeling that there was a tipping point in what happiness could be. And so first there was a book, then we did this crazy bus tour, and then we heard just from places all around the world telling us, hey, regardless of their religion, regardless if they were working, regardless of their background, they were saying, I understand that if I make a choice differently and prioritize happiness, my life could change. So I think we encountered a tipping point. Again, this was like 10 years ago now, and now here we are. For us as a company, delivering happiness, we're on this mission to change the way we work on a day-to-day basis. And why? It's because we believe in the science, we believe in the business sense, we can be more profitable in the end, and of course, in the human sense. If we have the ability to change the world with happiness, why wouldn't we do that? So since then, we've impacted over 1 million people. It's been pretty incredible. One PCC at a time, we call it people, communities, and companies. And so this is some pictures of our community. And here's another picture of a community that we've been working with, which is Dubai, or UAE. We've been talking about this in the other panels. And if you know about this place, it's probably one of the most fascinating places because here is the Prime Minister saying, we want to prioritize happiness for our people. At the same time, they have ATM machines with gold bars coming out of it. So it's a really interesting environment to be thinking about what meaningful happiness could be. And so this is what we're experimenting with Dubai. And of course, companies as well. So this is a big part of what we do, is helping companies figure out how to create what it means to have that foundational culture of purpose and values and people to live by it, so that they are all aligned, but not because their company's telling them to live by it, but because they want to, because they want to believe in something bigger. So I'm going to go into the frameworks that we use with all of our clients, and this is basically how we help them change their culture in a sustainable way, using the principles of happiness and positive psychology. So the two frameworks, one is the who and the other is the what. I'll start with the who. And so this is called the me-we community model. In the middle there is me. And that's most important because at the end of the day, we have the choice of whether or not we want to make this moment happy or unhappy. That's within us. So that's why we start with an individual employee. Make sure they feel they're being their whole self, bringing their authentic self to work. And then we go to the we, which is your team, your functions, your department, and then eventually community, which is your customers, your partners, your vendors, everyone in your ecosystem. The point we're trying to make here is that you don't have to choose one or the other. These can all live in harmony. The fact that you can focus on yourself and be true to who you are, that can live in harmony with also treating your customers right, and also giving back to your community, doing something better for the world than just making money. These can all coexist. So that's the who, and then we go to the what. And this is how you build foundational, sustainable culture. On the bottom there is creating the values and behaviors of what your company wants to believe in. And again, hire and fire by. In the middle there is science of happiness levers. So what I talked about earlier, am I progressing, am I growing, am I connected with my fellow coworkers? And then on top, of course, is higher purpose. All these three levels need to be aligned and existing for any company to want to say, hey, if I'm going to live by my culture and I want to make it sustainable, this needs to be implemented throughout the organization in an aligned way. So that's the what framework. And this is the operational slide. This seems a little boring, but it's actually the key to what we've learned and what we do as a company. Once you create this foundational culture, how do you actually make it live? And this is the question that everyone's been asking me. How do you make it live? You get that foundational culture and you bring every single business operation that you have, every organizational system. So whether it's hiring, firing, or rewards and recognition, or even a meeting, you take all those systems and run it through your foundational culture, and then you can see the results of your company and your employees actually living it in an organic but also authentic way. So back to this equation that I started at the beginning. Happy employees equals happy customers equals more successful company, but most importantly, you're creating meaningful lives with not just your customers, but also within yourselves and your coworkers. And time again, we see this in the stats of lower turnover, higher profitability, and of course, longer, healthier lives at the average of 7.5 years as individuals when we can be happy. So there's been a lot of clients that we've worked with along the way, and I wanted to mention a few case studies because then it becomes more real as to how does this all work. So one of them is this company out in Turkey. And here's a company that's been around 30 plus years. They were struggling because, and they're also in the construction space. And they were struggling and they didn't quite know what to do about it. So one of their VPs came over to San Francisco. We did this whole masterclass with them. And about 10 months later, I get this email, and it's probably the longest email I've ever seen in my life. And it's from this VP, and he was just saying all these different things that have happened because he went back and implemented these culture changes. He said all of a sudden, our retention of people leaving, it went from 30% to negative because people started coming back. And their sales were higher than it's ever been by about 2 times, double in their usual increase in sales. And this was all within just 10 months they saw that change. And then just a few months ago, they sent us another email and they just announced that they're actually the #1 great place to work in Turkey. So it was really incredible to see. Why I love this example so much is because here's a company in a country where there's a lot of turbulence going on, socioeconomically, politically, yet they were able to adapt. Going back to the adaptive age, they adapted and said, you know what, we'll control what we can, but we'll change and embrace the things that we can't control. So that's Campum. Another one here is DMG. DMG is actually a company in Egypt. Funny enough, another construction property development company. And what I love about this particular sample is that they took all these principles, applied it to their own organization. So they actually created and rebuilt their own corporate headquarters using their values and using the principles of culture. So every single different, like as an example, different rooms would represent a different value. They really took this, the culture work to heart. But what was also really cool about this story is that they truly applied the me, we community type of framework that we talked about. Because they said, we're going to change the way we work within the company, but our higher purpose is that we want to create happier lives for our people in Egypt. So they really took that model to heart of starting with themselves, but then also wanting to impact the greater world by creating happier communities in the buildings that they build on a day-to-day basis. So I love that story, and they, again, was awarded the top employer for that region because of their work and their doing. The last one I'll mention is Pioneer, and that's actually, I bring this up because they're here in Russia. And this is a great company because when I was here 5-6 years ago is when I did a talk, and I think this is when we first interacted with them. And what's ironic about the name of this company, Pioneer, is they really pioneered what it means to have culture in their company. So they decided to take us on, and since that time they had a lot of realizations, and some of the challenges they had were like many challenges that we have in our own companies, no matter where we are in the world. So it was communication, it was trust, openness, integrity between different departments. They were struggling because they weren't feeling like they were one team. So they decided, you know what, how do we want to address this? We want to use the ideas of company culture and positive psychology. So 7 months later, we had the pleasure to get the outcomes from it. So what they did was they revisited their values and their mission, because again, so many companies have, these are our values and mission, but do they really know it? And do they really believe it? And are they aligned by it? They also launched a culture ambassadors team, so essentially people within their companies that are naturally really passionate about culture That team was created so that they would be able to live out their culture in an organic and sustainable way. And the last thing, or they did many other things, but they solidified on one common goal. Before that, they had all these different ones, but by having a common language and codifying, essentially, their culture, they became much more unified in understanding what that common goal is. So we've been hearing amazing feedback from people in the organization. I won't read every single one, but they said they loved that it was so interactive. They had time to meet and reflect. It wasn't about criticism or condemnation. It was important that they're emphasizing and realizing the value of each person as a human being. And for themselves, they said, I haven't seen such a positive and an organized company that makes you think that this weird, intangible, high goal of changing the world seems so intangible, but for them, the work that they did as a culture made them realize it can be tangible and it can be realized within a company or organization. So I thought that was really interesting. I wanted to share, especially because obviously it's within Russia and being able to deal with like what you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So going back, I'm going to wrap this all up. And the question is, are we ready to reframe? Are we ready to reframe not just for our workplaces, or for our companies to be more profitable, but in the end, are we ready to reframe because we, as individuals, want to be happy? And not just at work, but in general life. So what are the ways that we can do it? And these are the ways that I shared and learned along the way. So if you are interested in tools, we've offered these free tools to anyone that would like more information about how to start your own journey. If you would like a sample of the culture book or a copy of this presentation, or we have also a measurement tool to see how happy you are at work. If you're interested in any of these things, feel free to email me. Or tweet us, again, I'll have those handles in a second. So these free tools, I will share with my contact information. But maybe before I go, I want to ask, what might you want to do here? And what might you want to think about now? So some questions to ask yourself: how committed are you to actually prioritizing your own happiness and trying to make it sustainable for yourself and for your company? What's your ROI of a happy culture? We didn't even have time to talk about this, but really when it comes back to the measurements, if you want to make it last, we want to make sure it's being measured as well. So, and the last question is, again, am I ready to reframe the way I work and the way that people work with me too? So these are my contact information. If you want any of those free tools, again, it's DH Movement. That's for the company, and for myself, it's DH Movement CEO. And if you want to email me, I'm old school like that. I actually like email. My personal email is Jen, that's JENN, @deliveringhappiness.com. So just to wrap this all up, and I know we have a Q&A after if you have any questions, but I'd just like to ask everyone in the room to take a moment and really just reflect and think. Just imagine for one moment if you were actually being true to your authentic, we call it weird, but your authentic self, whether you're at work or in general life. Imagine that. And then imagine if you were actually living by your senses of values, by your senses of passion, and your own higher purpose on a day-to-day basis. And then, the last thing, and then imagine what would change in your life, what would you do differently if you were to prioritize what it means to live a lasting, sustainable, meaningfully happy life. So after you have all that in your head, imagine in your head, then I ask just for one more thing, and that is to do. And I know that sounds so super simple, right? Just do it. But if it was easy, then we'd have happy people and happy companies all over the world. But we know that's not the case yet. Because what I've seen, especially in the last 15 years, is that change is happening. And I think the reason why is because we're understanding if we do want to change this world, sometimes that sounds such like a lofty idea, but if we do want to change that world, we know how to do it. And I think about this quote from a Persian poet, and his name is Rumi. He said, "When I was clever, I wanted to change the world. But when I got wise, I knew I had to change myself first. So that's why our belief at DH is, if you change your world as companies, as individuals, our belief is that we can actually together change the world. I just want to say thank you so much for everyone's time. Again, I'd love to hear any questions now, later. You can email whenever you can, whenever you want. Thank you. Спасибо.
Уважаемые гости, участники форума.
Dear guests, participants, let's thank Jen Lin. And now Q&A session. We have a microphone in the middle of the room. You can come down to the mic and ask your questions. And I'll come down if you need my assistance. Shall I do it in English or in Russian? In Russian. Thank you for your for sharing with your experience, your brave experience. So my question is the following. It's a little bit professional, but it will be understandable for everybody. The level of happiness of a human being depends on different factors. You've mentioned them, but one of the main most important factor is the structure of motivation, which depends on your common sense. And it's not that easy to make people happy in a company without taking this into account. People which at the different levels of their development, they have a different sense of happiness. Do you take this into account in your company? Probably you conduct tests, initial tests. Do you distribute people on the basis of this factor, the level of development and the structure of motivation?
Thank you for the question. It's a really good one, and it's something that we have to be honest about, because in some ways the question is associated with the whole idea of happiness being subjective. We as leaders or CEOs of our companies, even communities, we can't pretend to know, or we can't and we don't want to pretend to predict what others' happiness is. So for companies, for sure, it's basically building the foundation, so knowing that you want to have those shared values, but then giving them the freedom to understand where they are in basically in their sort of career trajectory. So there's a lot of different tools that we suggest now. As an example, it's like there's the Strengths Scope or Strengths Finder, and there's actually asking your teams to take these surveys to see what are they good at, what do they feel passionate about, what do they feel when they're in their flow. And by getting more data of understanding who they are, where they are in their career, where do they want to grow, then you have a better picture of how you can help them grow. So I think it's really important, and we recommend this for everyone, is to be able to take those snapshots. That's why measurement is so important for us, is that, because again, we can't assume that we know, or we can't predict what will make this person happy. For example, someone that starts in customer service and really loves the first year or two of the job might be bored in a year or two and say, hey, actually marketing looks pretty interesting. And if they have interest and they actually have some skills and they want to get trained, then there's nothing within us as adaptable organizations to say, no, you cannot do that. We want to embrace that, especially because we know how much it costs to replace that person, knowing that it's not a good fit. So for sure, the biggest recommendation is to understand where people are, and instead of telling them what to do, co-create those roles so that they actually want to show up and do the work. Thank you for the question. Спасибо.
So I have another question to you. So I would like to say that I'm very happy to be here, and it is a great privilege to ask you a question. So you are a brilliant example for us, and any person knows that to be very successful means to have an example. So as you are an example for us, I would like to know, what are your personal goals and what is your mission?
My personal goals and
your mission.
my mission for me personally or for the company?
For you, your personal goals.
My personal goals. It's funny, the panel I was on last time asked the same question at the end about personal happiness. I love how you're so comfortable in asking, just going directly into the personal stuff, which I'm really happy to share. But thank you for the question. I appreciate the words. Spasiba. My personal goals. Wow. So I've been reflecting that I've been in this almost 10 years now, for the company itself at least. But and I just did not imagine this to be the case. I mean, having a job around happiness, I didn't imagine it. I couldn't have predicted it. So I feel that now I have more substance within myself and also the company, but to want to share more about the lessons learned and the concepts of we know what works. It's just, yeah, I guess the more I've been in this, the more I want to live according to my values. And my values is personal freedom and relationships. And if I can connect those things and have an ability to share that message, not only from a verbal standpoint, but from a life standpoint, I feel that I'd be living my personal purpose. And that's just kind of, yeah, I hope I have the honor, privilege, and luck to be able to continue doing that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Спасибо за ваши вопросы, дорогие друзья.
Thank you for your questions. Before you ask another question, please introduce yourself. And you know the name of Jenny.
Moscow, I'm a teacher.
Ah.
I have been working as a teacher for 35 years.
Wow, that's amazing.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Experience. Thank you.
Yay, thank you.
Здравствуйте, Женя. Меня зовут Даси. Я являюсь поклонницей ваших работ. И здравствуйте.
Yes.
Женя, я являюсь поклонницей ваших работ, той деятельности, да, тому уровню счастья, который...
No. Is the translation on or am I?
Good morning. I admire your work. I admire you as a person. Good morning. I'm Dasi. I'm brand maker. I assist women experts, teachers, our CEO to build their own personal brand on the basis of their values, personal values, principles, and on the basis of what they would like to create around themselves. They personally, community, and the entire world around them. For me, your book about Zappos is a good manual for many years. When I'm losing my personal values, I reread this book, and I actually acquire them again. I understand that there will be a lot of mountains like Kilimanjaro we should be conquered, and we should create values around ourselves. But very often people who come to my course, who are building their brand and who got their results in 10 months or in a year time, they start to lose their mission, to lose their values, because life around us actually affects us. And you mentioned that you are happy that you open your mission, that you discover your mission. What is the source of this feeling? What helps you to maintain this in your life? It's important for all of us and for me personally. Thank you.
For the question. I don't know, insanity? It's, I think it's important to revisit what we think our values are, what we think our purpose is. Because I think as we, evolve through the phases of our lives, it's so easy to take things for granted and think, oh yeah, just because I learned that already, I don't need to learn anything anymore, or I can just assume that to be the case for the rest of my life. But I think and maybe this is why I believe in adaptive age so much, is like being able to change even when it's scary, but feels like it's the right thing to do, and not assume that everything that we've already learned is going to be true for the rest of our lives. I guess, I don't know, it's weird. I get older, and the older I get, the more curious I get. And the more I realize there's so much more to learn. Not just only about company culture, but just about myself and about people. And when I come to that realization, it became lighter. I felt more free in a weird way, even though that I'm admitting that I need to learn more. So I think every individual has their own way of keeping fresh, iterating, cycling, and things, and also not being too sad or disappointed when it doesn't work out. Yeah, and I feel that, because in the panel that we were just in, one guy was saying, I don't want to focus on happiness, and he's on the panel. I don't want to focus on happiness, I want to focus on unhappiness. And everyone's like, well, that's interesting. This is a happiness panel. But there was truth to that, because I want to be able to embrace it all. And I think, for me at least, that keeps me in it, because it's such a part of life. It just becomes this whole thing of making a better understanding of why we're all here and why I'm here. So I guess it's just constantly being curious and asking myself, what else can I learn? Yeah.
Постоянное обновление.
Constant renewal, to be fresh constantly.
Sorry for the long answer, but yes. Thank you for the question. Спасибо.
Спасибо за ответ. Да,
Thank you. Next question. Jenny, I'm Marina Esperanda. I'm life coach and business trainer, corporate business trainer. And my question is the following. As part of my work, I quite often, and this is actually my strategy, I'm quite often see that a key element is a positive or negative thinking. A person could face the same situation and be happy or unhappy. You've mentioned the previous panel when two different vectors have been discussed. When one person mentioned important things, saying that he would like to fight unhappiness, and another person says that facing the same issues, he is stressing the importance of happiness. Mother Teresa said that if you are against war, I'm not with you, but if you for peace, I'm with you. So we have to stress the components which are part of our happiness, and we can help to achieve this happiness. Is it possible to develop corporate policy training people to have positive thinking without ignoring problems, but to have positive thinking and stressing the importance of opportunities? Thank you.
Question, спасибо. If I'm understanding it right, is it possible to stress and underscore the importance of positive thinking along with the other side of negative thinking? Is that
на обучении позитивному мышлению?
How to train, how to learn, how to have positive thinking, and to take this into account while developing corporate policy.
so more focus on the positive side then? Okay. So it's interesting as there's like taking that gentleman for example, he just would not give up talking about we need to focus on happiness. Even then, we were all like, well, we can focus on both. We don't have to choose one or the other. Why does it have to be such a polar thing? I think when we think that way, and this is nothing against him, I said I respectfully disagree with you, but I think we can collectively agree that we do, yes, can focus on happiness and unhappiness, because it's only then that we can actually understand what that actually means, those polar extremes, and knowing everything can exist within. But what was interesting at the end of it, because the moderator asked, are you happy as personal speakers here, panelists? Are you personally happy? And when it got to him, what he said was, "I'm happy when I'm understood." And I thought that was interesting because here he was just focused on unhappiness the whole time, but he just basically shared what makes him happy. And that's basically the dawning of understanding why this guy's focused on happiness, because he doesn't feel understood. And he comes off as this guy like, that's my opinion and that's all what matters. So now it made sense. So I think it's a classic example of, even though he doesn't seem like a happy guy, he wants to focus on happiness, he says he's happy when he's understood. And so I thought that's an example of how to reinforce positive thinking, is to say to everyone, because happiness is subjective, so we can't predict what is going to make this person happy, but we can ask them. And the more we get to understand who they are, and that's why I talk about values and purpose so much, because I want to know what are your values and what is your higher purpose outside of making money. And once I get to know that, if I was your coach or if I was your boss, I would be able to say, hey, I get it now. Okay, this is what we're going to do. And it becomes this dialogue of just understanding another person. So I think you don't have, it's impossible to twist someone's arm and say, hey, you got to be happy now. You got to think positively. But what you can coach, is say, hey, if you want these certain things for your life, this is some ways to do it. This is some paths or options to do it. And then they open up to think, oh, it's not about happiness. It's about actually what makes them feel whole. So it's actually helping them feel selfish. Like, oh, I'm doing it for me. It's not for the company. So it's sort of a reframe. And I think it's an understanding of where people are coming from.
Well-being or happiness?
Yes, well-being or happiness. I don't have a preference. For me, we come from happiness, but other people like saying well-being better because it doesn't sound like you're talking about rainbows or unicorns. But I don't. However you want to define it, it's most important. It's just being true to who you are.
Дорогие друзья, у нас осталось...
We have 7 minutes left. So, one long question or 2 short questions. Good afternoon, Jin. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. You are a beautiful lady. My name is Irina Blagereva. I came from Kursk. I'm director of a child TV channel. I have a simple question to you. Do you have kids? Do you have children? Probably not your personal children, but do you have experience how to help children to be happy?
Have I experienced in helping children to be happy? Is that what the question was? I just want to make sure.
Если у вас есть ваши личные дети, как вы их...
If you have your own children, how you train them, how you help them to be happy?
Spasiba, thank you for the question. I don't have children. That's how I stay happy. I'm just kidding. No, I don't currently have children. I have a lot of nephews and nieces. I have 2 goddaughters. I feel like everyone in my company are my children. So if we're talking about them being younger, and it's such a different world than it was for us when we were growing up. As you know, I mean, it's just a different world now, and to be able to see it through their lens with curious eyes, I think, is what I've learned in how to treat the younger people in our lives. And I think the older that we get, the more we realize those years are so important. And we just never know which memories we'll actually retain from whether it's our parents or our teachers, people doing important work and how they impact everyone around us. And it's so incredible to know that there could be that one moment when I was 5 years old that I'll remember for the rest of our lives. And I think as human beings, and the older we get, and the more aware we are, the more we have kind of a responsibility to not just children either, to everyone around us, that we constantly impacting them in some way without even knowing. So I think that just makes me want to be more self-aware of what I'm putting out there, because you never know how it's going to impact someone's life for a child or even for an adult, good or bad. So I guess I'm just trying to remind myself of that. Thank you. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое. У нас остается время для
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Any other questions, feel free to email me as well. Myself and my team are always here for answering anything. Sorry.
Спасибо.
Thank you. My name is Natalia. I'm from Siberia, from Krasnoyarsk. I'm in charge of an educational program in rural areas and small settlements. Now we are facing with an issue of upscaling and franchising. So via community model, is it possible in a franchise? And if yes, how can it be implemented?
So I just want to make sure I understand your question. Is it possible to scale happiness and culture in franchises? Is that correct? Okay. Yeah, great. So it is possible. We've got clients that are actually franchises, and so we've worked for example, you may have heard of this franchise called McDonald's. So they obviously have all these independent owners, but what they were, I think what they sort of realized more recently again is that they forgot their original values, because what they were built on was actually, back in the day when the founders created McDonald's, they were like, hey, we're doing this because we're doing it for the customers. And over the years, they got bigger and bigger, and they forgot. And so I think with all the changes they've been going through, they remembered, like, oh, wait, we're actually doing this for our customers. And so they've been going through some cultural changes as well. But I think the bottom line with franchises is that you, as the franchise owner or the founder of everything, have the option to say how open or how guided with your principles do you want for all your other franchisees to live according to your values, live according to higher purpose. If it doesn't matter to you, then it won't matter to anyone else. But if they're so wanting to expand with another location, then it's like, if you yourself would say, I'm committed to this, unless you live by these values and believe in these values and higher purpose, I'm sorry, this partnership is not going to work. So the bottom line is this comes back to you and how much do you want to enforce it. As an example of delivering happiness, like a lot of people want to be partners and say, oh, I want to deliver happiness in this country or that country. But we say, well, are you going to be aligned with these values and our higher purpose? And it has to be real and authentic. And a lot of times it doesn't really work out that way. So we actually turn down money on the table because, especially for us, we have to make sure that our culture is aligned with our purpose and values. So it's possible. It might not be easy because you're turning down money, but if you believe in it, then it becomes easier. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое за вопрос. К сожалению, нет у нас времени.
Unfortunately, we do not have any more time for questions, but here is the website to refer questions.
Found time in each schedule and visited Moscow.
Oh, yes, thank
And
you.
thank you. I wish you a good luck and, of course, happy employees for all the companies you are working with.
Thank you.
So, and hope to see you soon in Moscow. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Дорогие друзья, аплодисменты Джен Лим.
Спасибо. Thank you so much, everyone.
Дорогие друзья,
Just want to say thank you.
дорогие друзья, мы сделаем небольшую паузу в работе.
Dear friends, we'll make a short break. The business agenda of the forum is continuous, so it is working non-stop in all Congress halls. At 2 o'clock, we will have another guest in Amur. At 2 p.m., we'll have a discussion dedicated to technical innovation in rehabilitation. In Volga Hall, we will talk about professional focus.
Плюс возможности самореализации и получения дохода для старшего поколения. В зале «Енисей» пройдет дискуссия под названием «Урбанистика счастья. Как построить город для людей». В ней принимают участие представители правительства Москвы, а также эксперты из США и Нидерландов. Тема обсуждения в зале Печора звучит следующим образом: инновационные подходы в политике занятости населения. Ну а в нашем зале, в зале Москва, в 14 часов выступление особого гостя форума. Это известный американский путешественник и писатель, автор книг «Голубые зоны» и «Правила долголетия» Дэн Бютнер. Существует ли рецепт долголетия? Можно ли действительно вычислить закономерности, благодаря которым люди живут больше 100 лет? Дэн Бютнер считает, что да, и каждый человек может создать собственную зону долголетия. На основе своих исследований он выделил 9 основных жизненных принципов, которые помогут прожить долгую и, самое главное, активную, продуктивную, счастливую жизнь. Итак, не пропустите выступление Дэна Бютнера. Мы ждем вас в этом зале, в зале Москва, ровно в 14 часов. А тем, кто уже занял комфортные места, хочу сказать, что совершенно не обязательно покидать зал, вы можете дождаться выступления прямо здесь. Спасибо большое и до скорой встречи.